Hello all, and thanks for coming to this presentation. I want to start by saying that this project is really about tracing ideas and connecting people involved with what I think of as the birth of forensic anthropology in the United States. That said, there's a lot to talk about and not a lot of time to really get into it, so I'm going to focus on the main points, and if anybody wants more information or would like to chat more about any of this stuff, just find me afterwards. In the first years of the journal Biometrica, a series of papers were published in the 1920s and 30s about the supposed skulls and portraits of famous historical figures and semi-quantitative attempts to authenticate them. These papers discussed skeletal remains, mostly crania, alleged to be from historical figures, as well as various portraits of those individuals. The papers focus on whether or not a cranium can be considered to be authentic or belonging to the particular individual based on the context of the remains and the similarity of those remains to portraits, as well as the authenticity of the portraits themselves. As an example, here are some images pulled from a paper by Pearson in 1924 concerning the skull and portraits of Robert the Bruce. Some of these papers also discuss modifications to the remains in conjunction with known antemortem conditions like syphilis, as well as documented perimortem and postmortem events. There are actually 5 papers dealing with the authentication of historic remains, starting with one by a woman named Miriam Tildesley, published in 1923, who we'll speak more about in a minute. This paper was followed by 3 papers authored by Karl Pearson in 1924, 1926, 1928, and the last such paper authored by Pearson and Morant in 1934. Ever since I read these papers, which occurred around the time that this photograph was taken, I always thought about this work and if it might have played some larger role in the development of forensic anthropology. That idea just always got pushed aside for other projects, in part because I figured I'd need some collaboration. And unfortunately for her, that's where my co-author comes in. Dr. Iris Clever is a historian of science currently working as a postdoc at the University of Chicago. I came across her work online and reached out, hoping she'd agree to help me with this project, and thankfully for me anyway, she was up for it. So let's talk briefly about the origins of forensic anthropology. While there are some early practitioners like Thomas Dwight or George Dorsey, forensic anthropology really started to become more mainstream, at least within the law enforcement and medical legal death investigation communities, following Wilton Krogman's 1939 publication of A Guide to the Identification of Human Skeletal Material in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin. Krogman's landmark publication was actually the result of a personal request from J. Edgar Hoover, who was a friend of Krogman's and was familiar with his work. And Krogman would actually go on to publish a few other articles in the FBI Bulletin, 2 of which were in 1943 and likely represent the first forensic anthropology case studies. But what do some papers on authenticating human crania by some early British race scientists have to do with Krogman and his contributions to forensic anthropology? Well, buckle up, and I'm going to do my best not to sound like a conspiracy theorist for the rest of this presentation while I try to tie all of this together. Let's start with Dr. Krogman. Wilton Marion Krogman was often referred to as Bill, was born in 1907 in Oak Park, Illinois, and got his bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Chicago. In 1925, while he was still an undergraduate, he wrote a term paper on the anthropology of human teeth, which he submitted to and won first place from the Chaim-Price Committee. Now, unbeknownst to him at the time, one of the judges for this prize was a Dr. T. Wingate Todd, who later wrote to Krogman with, quote, much vigorous, objective, and constructive criticism regarding his paper. This would begin an important relationship between Todd and Krogman that we argue is critical to the birth of forensic anthropology in the United States. This is because, as Krogman was nearing the end of his doctoral work, Todd arranged for him to have a fellowship at Western Reserve University, where Todd worked as the director of the anatomical laboratory. During his fellowship, Krogman wrote his dissertation and received his doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Chicago. After completing his doctoral degree, Krogman returned to the University of Chicago for a year teaching introductory anthropology. Krogman then spent about a year as a National Research Council Fellow, studying under Sir Arthur Keith at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. As noted by William Haviland, who wrote a biography of Krogman, the purpose of this fellowship was to develop a man and a viewpoint rather than produce a specific piece of work. Besides having many a fine discussion with Sir Arthur, Bill studied biostatistics with Karl Pearson's son, shared a laboratory with Louis Leakey, and got to meet the most prominent English anatomists and physical anthropologists of the time. From all this came a deep appreciation of the kind of cooperative research in both multi- and interdisciplinary approaches that Bill was to put into practice himself later on. In 1931, at the end of this fellowship, Krogman returned to the United States as a professor at Western Reserve University under the direction of Todd. He worked at Western Reserve University until 1938, when he returned to Chicago with a dual appointment as Associate Professor of Anatomy and Physical Anthropology. Shortly after Krogman left Western Reserve University, Todd died unexpectedly of a heart attack at the age of 53. The following year, in the foreword of Krogman's 1939 FBI Bulletin paper, he notes that, quote, "The material for this paper was gathered while I was a member of the staff of the Anatomical Laboratory, Western Reserve University, under the direction of the late Professor T. Wingate Todd." Additionally, in Krogman's second case study paper in 1943, which is on burned human remains, he notes, "I undertook to study the effect of various degrees of heat on dry bone, fresh bone, and the cadaver. This information was of use in an insurance case submitted to Dr. Todd in which I assisted. Based on the information we have about the relationship between Krogman and Todd, we think it's appropriate to describe Krogman as Todd's protege and intellectual heir. But with our limited time, let's now talk a little bit more about Dr. Todd. No doubt we are all aware of the contributions of Todd to biological anthropology, primarily through his collection of unclaimed bodies from Cleveland's Cuyahoga County Morgue, generating the vast majority of the Hammond-Todd collection, as well as his foundational work, particularly on age estimation, where he was able to pioneer the use of documented human skeletons from the Hammond-Todd collection to generate methods for examining and estimating parameters from unknown skeletal material. However, less well known is the fact that Todd consulted on a number of skeletonized forensic cases while in Cleveland at Western Reserve University. Unfortunately, due to a lack of available documentation, the extent of Todd's casework is unclear. What we do know is that he analyzed a number of the cases related to the Cleveland torso murders, as well as performed some other consulting work, and that on some occasions he had Krogman assist him. But that isn't the only thing that's noteworthy about Todd in regard to the history of forensic anthropology. Thomas Wingate Todd was born in Sheffield, England in 1885 and was an anatomist and surgeon by education. After completing his Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgeries degrees, which are equivalent to an MD today, Todd worked as a demonstrator and lecturer in anatomy in Manchester. In his biography of Todd, Shapiro states, "It was during this period that Todd came into intimate association with Sir Arthur Keith and Sir Grafton Elliot Smith. Much of his later preoccupation with anthropological problems grew out of this fruitful intercourse, which he was always to cherish. He never lost his devotion to these men who played an important part in his professional development." The importance of Keith and Smith to Todd cannot be discounted. For example, when Carl Hammond recruited Todd to come to Western Reserve University to be their new chair of anatomy, it was actually on Keith's recommendation, where he described Todd as, quote, "the best young man in England." And Kern, a historian who wrote his dissertation on Todd, notes that Todd would go on to name his firstborn son Arthur after his mentor Arthur Keith. Later, Todd would send a similar note to Karl Pearson, where he described Krogman as, quote, "the best of our younger anthropologists," asking Pearson to meet with Krogman while Krogman was abroad pursuing his fellowship with Keith, because this would, quote, "do a very great service to the progress of American physical anthropology, which at the moment needs your stimulating and stringent critical help." Unfortunately for Krogman, Pearson was not impressed after reading a few of his papers, and thus Krogman ended up spending time in Pearson's biometric laboratory with Geoffrey Morant instead, where he learned craniometry and became interested in the racialized contour work that the British biometricians were performing. How does any of this relate to those weird papers on authentication of crania by Tildesley and Pearson? Well, the first of those papers was written by Miss Miriam Tildesley back in 1923. In this paper, Tildesley essentially details what we would think of as the chain of custody of the remains, tracking their initial disinterment to her obtaining them for analysis. She then uses her statistical, anthropological, and biometric backgrounds to compare the cranium metrically to other English crania, as well as to portraits of the presumed individual. She, of course, also details the history of these portraits in order to argue the authenticity of the cranium belonging to Sir Thomas Browne. The later papers by Pearson basically take this initial effort by Tildesley and really bring it to a whole new level in terms of detail and effort. For example, while Tildesley's paper was 81 pages long, Pearson's longest authentication paper totals 226 pages. Tildesley's 1923 authentication work is actually cited by Todd and Lyons in their 1925 paper on cranial suture closure, where they describe her work as, quote, excellent, and Todd and Lyons then discuss the authenticity of a cranium possibly belonging to Descartes. But this link between Tildesley's authentication work to Todd via citation is not the only connection. Importantly, as you're not really going to be able to read here, the introductory note of Tildesley's 1923 paper was written by Arthur Keith, where he states that Tildesley came to perform this work due to an illness that affected Keith, who was originally tasked with this project. Keith notes that Tildesley was meant to assist him, but that due to an illness, Keith was, quote, compelled to hand the entire task over to her able hands, which has really been a blessing in disguise, as it has given Miss Tildesley the opportunity of manifesting an ability for research of high order. Throughout this monograph, she pursues the truth with a restless and logical diligence. We have here exemplified the best kind of scholarship, one which illustrates the right application of laboratory methods to historical inquiry and anatomical pursuits. Honestly, there's not a lot of information available about Miriam Tildesley. However, as luck would have it, the only real work on her happens to be in one of the chapters of a dissertation recently completed by none other than our great co-author, Dr. Clever. Despite not being able to find a picture of Tildesley, her accomplishments are noteworthy and include leading an international attempt to standardize skeletal and anthropometric measurements, authoring over 20 anthropological manuscripts, being awarded an MBE, or Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, for her services to physical anthropology in 1949, and even being considered for the presidency of the Royal Anthropological Institute in 1955. The self-described anthropological standardization godmother was born in Staffordshire, England in 1883 and trained to be a kindergarten teacher. However, after just 3 years of teaching in 1917, she left education and went to work as a statistical computer in Karl Pearson's biometric laboratory as part of the British effort of World War I. At this time, Pearson employed a number of women in his laboratory, largely because their salaries were half of those as their male counterparts, and thus he could hire more staff and look more productive by hiring women. Interestingly, Tildesley's position as a computing statistician was short-lived, as the following year she was appointed as the Crewdson-Bennington Research Student in Craniometry, where she was taught biometric data collection methods by Karl Pearson. Then, in 1920, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research appointed her to work on the human osteological collections at the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons under Arthur Keith. It is during this time that she performed the work and published the paper Sir Thomas Browne, His Skull, Portraits, and Ancestry. So, it's really through Miriam Tildesley, a woman trained in biometry by Pearson, in anthropology by Keith, and her efforts in authentication that we can kind of start to bring everything together, if you're still with me anyway. This early authentication work was performed and supervised by British race scientists, largely Pearson, a eugenicist, and Keith, who wrote a book about race as the origin of our modern nation-states, but also Tildesley and Morant. Not only was Todd familiar with their work, but these scholars were colleagues and mentors to Todd, some of which were directly responsible for Todd's interest in anthropology, and to whom Todd would later send his own protege Krogman for professional development. Additionally, we argue that not only were these collegial and intellectual connections crucial, but that the circumstances of Todd's work on documented skeletons and as a consultant on skeletal forensic cases created the perfect environment for the merging of medicine and anatomy, as practiced by Todd, and anthropology, as practiced by Krogman, setting the stage for forensic anthropology in the United States. All right, that's it. I want to say thanks to these folks. Thank you for listening. And like I said before, if you all have any questions or want to chat more about anything, just let me or Iris know. Thanks.